Hello everybody, it's Nick again. So I'll be starting off with chapter 5 of Nobilitas today. In the last video, I think you should go back and watch if you already haven't, but if not, that's okay as well, because each one sort of deals with a different era of history and a different group of thinkers from a different time period who had different beliefs on all roughly the same beliefs on monarchy, that monarchy is the most natural form of government. The last segment I did, we were talking about these ideas during the Renaissance and thinkers like Jean Bodin and Immanuel Kant, and their idea was that the law isn't a man-made construct. The idea is that the law comes naturally from God or from the divine nature of the universe, Dharma, or whatever you want to call it. And I thought that was interesting because it was kind of similar to C.S. Lewis's idea on morality, saying that there's a universal moral standard, and no matter what you do that's bad, you always try and justify it by that moral standard. You never just say, oh, to hell with the standard, I can do what I want. And so the idea then, the fact that everybody has an inbuilt system of morality shows some sort of divine nature to the universe. And then Jean Bodin and Kant were saying the idea that there's some concept of the law that's built within us, and our desire to have societies with laws is a manifestation of the divine plan. And the idea then is that societies are meant to organize, because only through an organized society can people get on track to realizing this ultimate purpose of the universe, whatever that is. And the cosmotheists, I'm kind of interested in their philosophy, and they were saying that wasn't mentioned in the book, but they were saying the idea that our path of evolution is towards some ultimate goal. And I guess that would go along with what these philosophers were saying, that the law is in place to organize a society that would allow people to act in their best capacity, to evolve to a higher level over generations. So we'll start with chapter 5 of Nobilitas. Chapter 5. The absolutism of Fichte is heightened in the writings of G.W.F. Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831. Hegel's famous glorification of the state is indeed a result of his peculiar brand of objective idealism, which, contrary to Fichte's subjective doctrines, maintains that the external realization of the idea in the world is superior to its original state as mere being. Fichte, too, had declared that the material manifestation of the universal self was due to its desire for self-consciousness, but the external world is merely a practical projection of the divine self itself, so that there is no special virtue in the physical cosmos above that of the universal self. Indeed, Hegel's morality is not a priori, like that of Kant or Fichte. Unlike the latter two philosophers, who began with an a priori principle of moral law which is only gradually realized in the world of men, Hegel believed that the changing political institutions of man in the course of history were increasingly perfect moral orders precisely by virtue of the external interactions of men with one another in society, and not by reference to any original law that a divine self essentially represents. This said, it must be added that Hegel does not conceive of progress as a linear development stretching indefinitely into the future, but rather cyclically, according to a dialectical process whereby the synthesis of an earlier historical stage or thesis and the stage that follows it as its antithesis is at once the thesis of a new dialectical historical series. Thus, despotism and democracy will ever be followed by a synthesis of constitutional monarchy. In Hegel's cycles of political progress, the main fault of Hegel's dialectical scheme is that it will, at any given stage in the course of history, justify the existing political regime as necessary for the progress of mankind, and not condemn it adequately by reference to absolute political principles. And footnote, the literature on Hegel's political philosophy is extensive, but for an interesting discussion pertinent to the present study, see H. Kaisvetter's Von Hegel zu Hitler. End of footnote. The major steps that Hegel recognizes in the history of mankind are those marked by the rise of family feeling, then tribal organization, and lastly, the state. The state is the acme of man's life and the consummation of the idea as objective reason. Quote, the state is thus the embodiment of rational freedom. Realizing and recognizing itself in an objective form, the state is the idea of spirit and the external manifestation of human will and its freedom. End quote. This means that the state is itself the highest divine institution, and the individual must be completely subordinated to it. Freedom is redefined by Hegel not as the subjection of the individual will to the universal will of the divine self, but rather as the subjection of the moral conscience of the individual to the dictates of the state. Needless to add, the so-called natural law was not worth anything in comparison to the law of the state. In short, therefore, Hegel dismisses not only subjective morality, but also all forms of abstract law as being mere preparatory stages for the rise of social ethics, or Sittlichkeit. Besides, the law of the state is the only court of justice that there could possibly be, since abstract rights are of little value in Hegel's philosophy. The state laws should furthermore be enforced by the state through a police system that not only prevented crime, but also supervised public improvements, including education. Like Carlyle, Hegel believed in the special dispensation of great men to form and rule states with absolute power, since they represented the Weltgeist. However, once the state has been established, it will henceforth be ruled by a constitutional and hereditary monarchy. Unlike the common method of voting a leader in a democracy, which is, quote, grounded on the will interpreted as the whim, opinion, and caprice of the many, end quote, the monarch is raised to the dignity of monarchy in an immediate natural fashion, i.e., through his birth in the course of nature. However, the monarch will not have absolute powers as in a true monarchy, but be bound to the law, as in Prussia. Quote, in a well-organized monarchy, the objective aspects belong to the law alone, and the monarch's part is merely to set the law, the objective I will, end quote. Nevertheless, Hegel goes on to point out that although the monarch is, quote, bound to the concrete decisions of his counselors, and if the constitution is stable, he has often no more to do than sign his name. This name is important. It is the last word beyond which it is impossible to go, end quote. The Constitution, according to Hegel, is, as it was for Maistre, to be treated not as something made, even though it has come into being in time. It must be treated rather as something simply existent in and by itself, as divine, therefore, and constant, end quote. But Hegel's exaltation of the Constitution, unlike Maistre's, is due to his veneration of the state that it represents. The monarch is to be aided in government by an executive bureaucracy, and a legislative body constituted of an upper house of landed aristocrats and a lower house of commercial corporations. Hegel also divided the population of the state into three classes: the agricultural, representing the most unreflecting section; the industrial and commercial class, which is dominated more by reason but is still bound to a petty particularity of interest; and the universal class, which is destined to govern the state. It is interesting that the economic features of Hegel's state also included a system of corporations in the manner of medieval guilds that would represent the universal activity of man, rather than his merely private interests. For this feature too, along with the general Hegelian tendency to a totalitarian state, was put into effect during the Fascist regime in Italy. While there may be mobility within the classes, the universal class, once constituted, must be fully committed to ensuring the prevalence of the law in all sections of the state. Needless to add, the political system outlined by Hegel is opposed to democracy, since the latter system becomes, quote, everyone's between, end quote, and all seek to meddle in the affairs of the state. He restricted electoral rights to those that are gifted with learning, knowledge of public affairs, and property. In short, Hegel too envisaged an aristocracy of talent as the main basis of government. Much as Hegel taught the dialectic progress among men, he did not, like Kant, envisage a final stage of political evolution that would be international in scope. Rather, the national state is indeed the highest possible realization of the universal idea, and the future course of history will be determined by the mutual strife between nations, in which the strongest will win. It is clear that Hegel's entire system is a glorification of his own Prussian state, a fact that is confirmed by the practical application of it in the Second and Third Reichs of Bismarck and Hitler, respectively. Hegel not only insisted that hereditary, constitutional monarchy was the sole rational form of government, but also glorified war as the best means of encouraging patriotism and devotion to the state. Hegel's justification of war are indeed among the most embarrassing a posteriori statements in his philosophy. Not only is war a Heraclitean law of nature, but it is, he declares, salutary in its effects. Quote, "War has the highest significance that by its agency the ethical health of peoples is preserved in their indifference to the stabilization of finite institutions. Just as the movement of the ocean prevents the corruption which would be the result of perpetual calm, so by war people escape the corruption which would be occasioned by perpetual peace." End quote. In fact, war is a great aid to morality, since, quote, "It is necessary that the finite life and property should be definitely established as accidental, because accidentally is the concept of the finite." End quote. Hegel's philosophy of the state may bear more superficial resemblance to Aristotle's and Gentile's, but Hegel's emphasis on the state as the objective aspect of the idea is basically different from Gentile's veneration of it as a subjective ideal. Similarly, Aristotle's glorification of the city-state is only as a collective manifestation of the virtue of the individuals that constitute it, rather than as the supreme objectification of an idea. The corrective to the rather artificial objective, idealistic political theory of Hegel is to be found in the philosophy of the will of Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived from 1788 to 1860. Schopenhauer bases his system on the primacy of the will to live, which is identified with Kant's Ding an sich. This will is the essence of nature, which in its objectification results in the unending forms of life. These forms are all characterized by strife, since the will is ruled by desire for that which it lacks. This renders all life, vegetable, animal, and human, a mass of opposing voluntary forces, and gives credence to Hobbes' description of life as bellum omnium omnes. The only way that this frustrating strife may be resolved is by negating the will, and this is possible only among men of the utmost enlightenment, who gradually renounce all earthly desire by devoting themselves to the contemplation of the world as idea, or that stage of the will prior to its objectification. Although Schopenhauer's method of philosophy is admittedly an a posteriori one, the metaphysical and ethical conclusions of his system are all quite Platonic. Hence, this similarity between his political theories and those of Fichte and Plato, within the context of social life, the state is that institution which safeguards man against his worst nature. Quote, "The state is nothing more than an institution of protection, rendered necessary by the manifold attacks to which man is exposed, and which he is not able to ward off as an individual, but only in alliance with others." End quote. The aims of the state are 1. Protection against inanimate forces and those of hostile animals and men. 2. The protection of members of the state from one another, quote, "by means of an honest and fair state of things," end quote. And 3. The protection of society against the protector himself, in other words, the ruler, so that the legislature, judiciary, and executive are properly separated from one another. The first of these modes of protection entails a theory of international law which is based not on positive law, since there are, or at least were not in Schopenhauer's time, really no judges to adjudicate international disputes, but on natural law. But the natural law is interpreted idealistically by Schopenhauer as one that insists that men conduct themselves in such a way that they do not harm each other, either as individuals or as nations. We note that Schopenhauer's political theories are ultimately based on the ethical foundations of his system. For the highest justice that can prevail on earth is, according to him, that based on compassion or sympathy. Quote, "All genuine virtue proceeds from the immediate and intuitive knowledge of the metaphysical identity of all beings." End quote. And in a footnote here, the world as will and representation, Schopenhauer's theory of the state may bear some resemblance to Hobbes. Schopenhauer himself acknowledges his admiration of Hobbes' system, but mainly on account of the latter's characterization of the human condition as homo homine lupus, and the need of a strong political authority to discipline it. Otherwise, Schopenhauer's doctrine of kingship as well as his ethical ends are quite opposed to Hobbes. See also R. Nieder, die Rechtsphilosophie Schopenhauers und ihr Schweigen zum Widerstandsrecht. End of footnote. While seeking the protection of all within a state, Schopenhauer is nevertheless not a democrat, but rather a true monarchat. monarchist. For he keenly perceives that the reason of monarchy is that it embodies in the person of the king an individual who is above all petty human desire, since he virtually lacks nothing. Quote, "The great value, in fact the fundamental idea of monarchy, seems to me to lie in the fact that because men remain men, one must be placed so high and be given so much power, wealth, security, and absolute inviolability, that for himself there is nothing left to desire, to hope, or to fear. In this way, the egoism that dwells in him, as in everyone, is annihilated, as it were, by neutralization, and, just as if he were not a human being, he is now enabled to practice justice, and to have in view no longer his welfare, but only that of the public. This is the origin of the seemingly superhuman character which everywhere accompanies the dignity of royalty, and distinguishes it so entirely from mere presidency." End quote. The kingship must also be hereditary, since no one else must consider himself equal to the king or his family. More shrewdly than Hegel, Schopenhauer recognizes that the state cannot take the place of a monarch as the supreme law of the land. Quote, "A state constitution that embodies abstract right would be an excellent thing for natures other than human. But since the great majority are extremely egoistic, unjust, inconsiderate, deceitful, and sometimes even wicked, and since, in addition, they are endowed with very meager intelligence, there arises from this the necessity of a power which is concentrated in one man, is itself above all law and right, and is wholly irresponsible, a power to which all must submit, and which is regarded as something of a higher order, a ruler by the grace of God. In the long run, only in this can we, mankind, be curbed and governed." End quote. Schopenhauer is opposed to the glorification of the state as the highest purpose of human existence, since it is created only as a means of providing the conditions whereby the metaphysical and natural law of sympathy may prevail. Schopenhauer also addresses in this connection the question of right as opposed to might, and recognizes the need of the latter to enforce the law amongst the people. He declares that physical force alone is capable of securing respect, but such force is found originally with the masses, where it is associated with ignorance, stupidity, and injustice. Accordingly, in such difficult circumstances, the primary task of statesmanship is to subject physical force to intelligence and mental superiority, and to make it serve these." End quote. Although Schopenhauer recognizes the disadvantages of slavery in that it is a consequence of luxury among the higher classes, he is realistic enough to realize that luxury is necessary in order to ensure that the higher classes have the means and leisure to develop the higher arts of peace and war. The need of superior classes to lead the lower ones is incontestable. We must mention the fact that the great flock of the human race necessarily needs everywhere and at all times leaders, guides, and counselors, in many different guises according to the affairs in question, such as judges, physicians, scholars, philosophers, and so on. All these have the task of leading through the labyrinth of life this race, which for the most part is exceedingly incapable and perverse." End quote. A glaring example of the opposite policy of democracy is supplied by America, where, quote, "In spite of all the material prosperity in the country, we there find as the prevailing attitude sordid utilitarianism, with ignorance as its inevitable companion, which has paved the way to stupid Anglican bigotry, shallow conceit, and coarse brutality, in combination with a silly veneration of women." End quote. Indeed, in all republics it is extremely difficult for men of real intellectual worth to gain high positions in the state, since, quote, "Always, everywhere, and in all circumstances, all those with narrow, feeble, and vulgar minds are at once in league or instinctively united against men of superior intellect, and regard them as their natural foe. They are firmly held together by their common fear of such men, and in spite of all having equal original rights, men of inferior ability outnumber the others by 50 to 1. End quote. In a monarchy, on the other hand, the king, seeing that his interests are firmly bound up with those of his country and are inseparable from and identical with them, will naturally give preference and show favor to the best because they are his most suitable instruments. Besides, nature itself is monarchical in its organization, and even the animal organism is constructed monarchially. The brain alone is the guide and governor, the hegemonicon. He even goes so far as to suggest that the antidote to democratic stupidity is the eugenic cultivation of a genuine aristocracy and nobility, so that the nation will be ruled by a despotism of the wise and noble. Such a rule will be contrary to both constitutional monarchies such as England's and to democratic governments that are run on the foolish Semitic and materialist assumption that, quote, the world is an end in itself, and so in itself, that is, according to its natural constitution, is admirably arranged and a veritable abode of bliss. They think that if only governments did their duty, there would be a heaven on earth. In other words, that all could gorge, guzzle, propagate, and die without effort and anxiety. End quote. The freedom of the press is more deleterious than advantageous to the proper conduct of a nation, and women should not be considered as equal citizens along with men. Jews, too, must be considered an alien people, since no matter where they may be, they constitute an independent race, which, quote, mindful of Abraham, who dwelt in Canaan as a stranger, but who gradually became master of the whole land, as his God has promised him, would also like to set foot somewhere and take root in order to arrive once more at a country without which, of course, a people is like a ball floating in the air. Till then, it lives parasitically on other nations and their soil, but yet it is inspired with the liveliest patriotism for its own nation. End quote. They must, therefore, be denied all political rights and prohibited from taking part in the administration and government of European nations. We see in Schopenhauer's political philosophy a reinforcement of the subjective idealism of Fichte, which envisages the self-realization of man in an aristocratic disdain of personal interest and ambition and a constant desire for a higher harmony of enlightened mankind. Chapter 6. The political views of the German idealists, especially Fichte and Hegel, are closely repeated in the writings of several European nationalists. Fichte's idealism, for instance, is reflected by Thomas Carlyle in England and Giuseppe Mazzini and Giovanni Gentile in Italy. Like Plato, Kant, and Fichte, the English historian Carlyle, who lived from 1795 to 1881, insisted that moral education was the basis of all political activity and that the government should lie in the hands of a small group of spiritual aristocrats. The moral code which Carlyle pointed to was the same as the will of God, to which all men should subject their individual wills. In order to recognize this universal divine will, one must not use the understanding, but rather reason, which is an intuitive faculty of direct spiritual perception. It is through the exercise of this faculty that man perceives the ideal world of unchanging and essential order. The possession of this higher reason is due to the fact that the innermost soul of man is indeed divine. Quote, what is man himself in his whole terrestrial life but an emblem, a clothing or visible garment for that divine me of his, cast hither like a light particle down from heaven? End quote. Unlike Fichte and Kant, and more like Schopenhauer, Carlyle maintains that the natural law was ultimately the same as the divine law. Both of these are opposed to the absurdities of democracy. Quote, the laws of the universe, of which the laws of England are not an exact transcript, though they should passionately study to become such, are fixed by the everlasting congruity of things that are not changeable by voting. End quote. Democracy is only a negative stage before the realization of the true goal of society. Quote, in democracy can lie no finality. With completest winning of democracy, there is nothing yet won except emptiness and the free chance to win. Democracy is, by the nature of it, a self-canceling business, and gives in the long run a net result of zero. In Rome and Athens, as everywhere, if we look practically, we shall find that it was not by loud voting and debating of many, but by wise insight and ordering of a few that the work was done. So is it ever, so will it ever be. End quote. To those who point to American democracy as a successful model, Carlyle replies, quote, sure enough, these hardy millions of Anglo-Saxon men prove themselves worthy of their genealogy, and with the axe and plough and hammer, if not yet with any much finer kind of implements, are triumphantly clearing out wide spaces, seed fields for the sustenance and refuge of mankind, arenas for the future history of the world. But, as to a model republic, or a model anything, the wise among themselves know too well that there is nothing to be said. Their quantities of cotton, dollars, industry, and resources I believe to be almost unspeakable, but I can by no means worship the likes of these. What great human soul, what great thought, what great noble thing that one could worship or loyally admire has yet been produced there. End quote. Regarding the origin of the state, Carlyle believed that it was most probably first achieved through conquest and by a strong, heroic personality acting as the agent of providence. Although Carlyle championed the rule of heroes, he, like Fichte, insisted that these heroes continue to be just in their absolute rule, or else their overthrow would be justified, as in the case of the French Revolution. The government should rest at all times in the hands of a true aristocracy of talent. This group would be most unlike the aristocracy of recent times, who had dissipated the wealth and power they had acquired from their worthy ancestors. They would also be opposed to the new industrial plutocracy that had risen to power as a result of the Industrial Revolution. As Carlyle rhetorically put it, are they born of other clay than the old captains of slaughter, doomed forever to be no chivalry but a mere gold-plated doggery? What the French well-named canaille, doggery, with more or less gold carrion at its disposal. End quote. Much like Burke, Carlyle observes that the history of Europe has shown that Europe requires a real aristocracy, a real priesthood, or it cannot continue to exist. By aristocracy, Carlyle means a governing class, and by priesthood, a teaching class. These two, sometimes separate and endeavoring to harmonize themselves, sometimes conjoined as one, and the king a pontiff king. There did no society exist without these two vital elements. There will none exist. End quote. The new order envisaged by Carlyle will be an aristocracy drawn from all classes of society, who will devote themselves to the revitalization of society. Although this aristocracy will constitute a sort of superior civil service, Carlyle also believed that the ultimate leadership should be invested in a single person, a king or an enlightened dictator. Parliament then will act as an advisory body rather than as a governing one. This supreme leader, to judge from the examples that Carlyle gives of heroes such as Cromwell and Napoleon, will presumably rise to power through force, since democratic methods of selection are completely inadequate and undesirable. These dictators are, in Carlyle's view, agents of providence, just as Fichte's heroes were, since they will be establishing the will of the universe within their own nation. The state should devote itself to the full development of the potentialities within its citizens, and especially their innermost divine potentialities. Personal freedom for Carlyle, as also for Kant and Fichte, is thus not a matter of doing what one wills, but of doing that which should be done. This is the clearest contradiction of the system of democracy. As Carlyle puts it, surely of all the rights of man, this right of the ignorant man to be guided by the wiser, to be gently or forcibly held in the true courses by him, is the indisputablest. End quote. For such a state as Carlyle's laissez-faire, too, is out of the question, since it has constituted anarchy, the choking, sweltering, deadly, and killing rule of no rule, the consecration of cupidity, and brain folly, and dim stupidity, and baseness in most of the affairs of men. End quote. Industry should be governed by a contract between laborers and capitalists that would ensure that the former would work hard under pain of punishment or starvation, and the latter would guarantee the health and comfort of his employees. The government should thus be paternalistic and intervene in every aspect of social life to ensure its proper functioning. As regards international politics, given Carlyle's belief in the superiority of some races to others, the Negro, for instance, is destined to slavery by the eternal laws of God, it is not surprising that he considered it the right of the Germanic nations, and especially Britain, to civilize the rest of the world. The political writings of Giuseppe Mazzini, who lived from 1805 to 1872, the Italian historian and political leader, reveal everywhere the influence of Fichte's idealistic philosophy of the state. Opposed to the Eudaimonism of the English utilitarians who followed Bentham and Mill, Mazzini proposed that the duty of the citizen was not the acquisition of personal happiness, but rather moral improvement. As he put it, quote, "With the theory of happiness of well-being as the primary aim of existence, we shall not only form egotistic men, worshippers of the material, who shall carry the old passions into the new order of things and corrupt it in a few months. We have therefore to find a principle of education superior to any such theory, which shall guide men to better things, teach them constancy and self-sacrifice, and link them with their fellow men without making them dependent on the ideas of a single man or on the strength of all." End quote. In this respect, as well as in his views that the earth is, quote, "the place appointed for our labor of self-improvement and of development towards a higher state of existence," Mazzini was one with Fichte, who also had stressed the need of the harmonic cooperation of diverse individuals in society, since this constituted the very reason of their earthly lives. The government should be devoted entirely to the achievement of this goal. Not natural rights, but natural duties were to be the main concern of both government and citizenry. Unlike the liberals who advocated laissez-faire, Mazzini insisted on the duty of the state to supervise closely all individual activities in the interests of the community as a whole. The community that Mazzini was interested to preserve was naturally not an international one such as the liberal cosmopolitanism desired, but rather the nation-state to which an individual belonged. Like Fichte, Mazzini maintained that all sovereignty is in God, in the moral law, in the providential design which governs the world, and is gradually revealed by the inspirations of men of virtuous genius, and by the natural tendency of humanity in the different epochs of its existence. The mere vote of a majority cannot represent this law. Only an enlightened individual can be the best interpreter of the moral law, and if he fails in this supreme task, he must be deposed. Although Mazzini did not espouse the cause of monarchy, he attempted to revert to the model of the republic in ancient Rome, which was led invariably by a dictator. Like Fichte and Kant, Mazzini viewed the course of history up to this time as a providential design that would culminate in the perfect republic of the future. History, according to him, could be divided into two major periods. The first ranging from the Greek republics to the French Revolution, corresponding to the growing demand for liberty and equality, and the second from that revolution to the present, representing the rise of a new philosophical order of duty and association. The French Revolution was inadequate insofar as it was a narrowly individualistic, materialistic movement, which qualities he attributes to its Christian elements. Quote, "The conception of life from which all those instructions issued by the Revolution emanated was identical with that which I have already shown as inspiring encyclopedists of Montesquieu and Rousseau. The end of human existence is for all of them material well-being, the means to reach it, liberty." End quote. Mazzini's own ideal was like Fichte, based on the moral law which binds individuals to a national unity. In this respect, Mazzini favors not liberty of belief and education, but much like Fichte, a strong national uniformity of thought and faith. Quote, "Liberty of belief destroyed all community of faith. Liberty of education produced moral anarchy. Men without a common tie, without unity of religious belief and of aim, and whose sole vocation was enjoyment, sought every one his own road, not heeding if in pursuing it they were trampling upon the heads of their brothers in name and enemies in fact. To this we are come today, thanks to the theory of rights." End quote. A sound national education, counteracting the current fashion of liberty of teaching, is the only way of elevating the people to an understanding of the true purpose of life. Universal suffrage may work in a nation with a uniform spiritual culture, but not in a multicultural state. Quote, "Universal suffrage in a country dominated by one faith will give expression to the tendencies to the will of the nation, while in a country lacking in a common belief, how can it express anything except the interests of those who are numerically strongest and the oppression of all the rest?" End quote. One of Mazzini's major economic doctrines deriving from his insistence on mutual cooperation with the state is the theory of associationism, which is, as it were, the philosophical model of the corporate state of Mussolini. Mazzini's corporatism is the antithesis of the communist state, which according to him, quote, "would be a life of beavers, not of men. The liberty, the dignity, the conscience of the individual would all disappear in an organization of productive machines. Physical life might be satisfied by it, but moral and intellectual life would perish, and with its emulation, the choice of free association, stimulus to production, joys of progress, and all incentives to progress." End quote. Nor was it, by any means, a call for Jeffersonian democracy, which, quote, "centers itself in the sense of liberty alone, smothers the principle of association under the omnipotence of the ego, plants mistrust in the civil organization, introduces materialism, individualism, egoism, and a contradiction to the doctrine of the atheism of the law and the sovereignty of rights and interests." End quote. Indeed, Mazzini's ideal of the voluntary organization of workers and producers into corporate guilds by the state was motivated directly by a strong feeling of revulsion for materialism, which, quote, "denies humanity, in which the religious sense, like the artistic and philosophical, is an alienable element of life. It denies tradition, the harmony of which, the voice of individual inspiration and conscience, is the sole criterion of truth we possess on earth. It denies history, which teaches us that religions are transitory, but religion is eternal. It denies the solemn witness born in adoration of God and the ideal by the long series of our greatest minds, from Socrates to Humboldt, from Phidias to Michelangelo, from Aeschylus to Byron. It denies the power of revelation innate in man." End quote. And a footnote here, from the Council to God. The same essay contains a list of the points on which Mazzini was opposed to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Whereas the latter believed in miracles or the possible violation of the laws regulating the universe, he believed in, quote, the secrets of an intuition inaccessible to analysis, and the truth of our strange presentiment of an ideal which is the primitive fatherland of the soul, end quote. Whereas the latter believed in a God who has created and reposes, he, like Descartes, believed in continuity of creation, whereas the latter believed in a heaven extrinsic to the universe. He believed in one heaven in which we live and move and love, which embraces the whole indefinite series of existences through which we pass. Whereas the latter believed in the resurrection of the body, he believed in the transformation of the body, which is not other than an instrument adapted to the work to be achieved, in conformity with the progress of the ego, and with the mission destined to succeed the present. In short, the latter dogma humanizes God. Our dogma teaches the slow, progressive divinization of man. End of footnote. The true successor to Mazzini in Italy was Giovanni Gentile, who lived from 1875 to 1944, who served as the official philosopher of the Fascist regime from 1922 until his death in 1944 at the hands of communist assassins. Gentile's philosophy is the culmination of the subjective idealistic traditions begun by Fichte, and his political views constitute some of the most subtle and lucid applications of idealistic philosophy to the problems of the state. Gentile's system is based on the Kantian and Fichtean primacy of the ego as the transcendental synthetic unity of pure subject and pure object, or form. The activity of the ego is self-conscious and results in the form of thought. But this activity is bound by the same unity that characterizes the ego, so that it is always universal and infinite, and never divisible into a multiplicity of entities. Thus, the proper intellectual activity of the individual is the comprehension of the whole of mankind, or of the idea of it. This is in marked contrast to the superficial individualism of the positivists and realists, who conceive of individuals as atomic units and produce so-called liberal systems of political government, which finally lead to stark anarchism. As Gentile put it, anarchism pushes the theory of individualism to its ultimate logical conclusion, whereby liberals appeal to it and then strive in eclectic fashion to reconcile it with the substantiality of the community of people. Gentile's trust in the supremacy of the state derives from his theory of the original condition of the ego and its pure object, or alter ego, as transcendent society. Quote, the drama in which the interlocutor, the alter ego, takes part in a dialogue with the ego is the transcendental society, which is what makes man a political animal in an absolute sense. From the moment when he is reflectively aware of himself and becomes a real individual, in synthetic unity of self and other as opposites which are therefore identical, all the more determinate and complex types of society are only derivatives of this primitive form and differ from it simply because of the different content that comes to maturity and experience. Since the transcendental society is not an entirely solipsistic state, the gradual self-realization of an individual implies the corresponding enlightenment of others so that they too begin to approach the ideal. Quote, if other men are really identical with me, then I can never really understand myself without understanding them. Nor can I use my own lively understanding to advance my development and gradually shape my character, without at the same time advancing the development of others and making them even more nearly adequate to my ideal. All human cruelty is a result of imperfect knowledge, exactly as it is in Plato and Plotinus. The basis of evil is matter, or nature, which is opposed to spirit and represents, not merely moral and absolute nullity, the impenetrable chaos of brute nature, mechanism, spiritual darkness, falsehood, and evil, all the things that man is forever fighting against. Since the state is the universal common aspect of the will, the true function of politics is the dematerialization of human life and its return to its original spiritual condition. Economic activity, therefore, cannot be the basis of such an endeavor, for it is synonymous with nature, mechanism, and abstract rationalism. The utilitarianism of economic life is akin to the instinctual life of animals, and is a life of slavery to matter, whereas politics is a means of spiritual freedom. Gentile was, to be sure, a staunch opponent of Marxism, for the latter represented the worst sort of social organization, the utilitarian, materialistic, and hence egoistic conception of life, understood as a realm of rights to be vindicated instead of as an arena of duties to be performed by sacrificing oneself to an ideal. Opposed to all forms of rationalism, Gentile called for a more vital spiritual attitude to life. Quote, "Fascism is and should be an enemy without truce or pity, not against intelligence, but against intellectualism, which is a disease of the intelligence. For intelligence too is will, and fascism at least feels this, disdaining the culture that is an ornament of adornment of the brain, and longing for a culture by which the spirit is armed and fortified for winning ever new battles." End quote. The state, being an absolute image of the will of God, the real laws of a state are unchangeable, since they must be in total consonance with divine law. This explains the natural affinity between religion and the state in the course of civilized history, and of the theory of the divine origin of kingship. Religion cannot under any circumstances be used as an expedient instrument of the state, as Machiavelli had suggested. Gentile supports Campanella in the latter's opposition to Machiavelli, since religion to both Campanella and Gentile is not an external aid to the will of the state, but the constitutive element of it. In his essay on monarchy, L'idea monarchia, Gentile declares that the spiritual authority and tradition of a state are best represented by a supreme individual, such as the king. Quote, "The person of the king is that sacred, inviolable person which the citizen must find, if he can, at the heart of his consciousness of the nation. It is his own true personality, and where this profound inward unity has not yet been formed, or has disappeared, the legitimacy which gives spiritual value to the institution and authority of the monarchy is lacking or has died out. For in such a case the duality exists, but it is not a duality that can be consolidated in the peaceable process of actual political life, since the fundamental unity is lacking out of which the two terms ought to have arisen. Anti-monarchical revolutions are the first instigated by the bourgeois. However, the proletariat soon rises in revolt against even the liberals' limited conception of the state and surges of communism. The resulting syndicalism is totally misguided, since it views individuals as atomic entities without any organic unity, and, as Gentile explains, quote, "This view is only possible if we accept the standpoint of materialism and regard society as a multitude living together and obliged to accept the unity to which they are in themselves absolutely opposed. A group of mutually alien individuals engaged in a war of all against all, or of syndicates, equally alien and hence unable to achieve a unity which is contrary to their nature." End quote. Some footnotes here. Genesis, page 130. We see in Gentile's use of the phrase made famous by Hobbes the real reason of natural strife, namely matter and the atomism that is constituted of it, or that it is constituted of. End quote. End footnote. The true political liberty is possible only when, as Mazzini had pointed out, the individuals that constitute the state are free, for the free individual is the free state. Since the state is not really a relationship between individuals, it lies within the individual, in that unity of particular and universal which constitutes his individuality. We note here the crucial difference between Gentile's subjective conception of the state and Hegel's more superficial objective view of it. Quote, "The state is indeed the collective psyche of the people. We regard the state as the very personality of the individuals themselves, robbed of their accidental differences, a personality rooted in the deepest parts of its consciousness, where the individual feels the general interest as his and hence wills it as with a general will." End quote. Since the individual is truly an individual only when he achieves a certain degree of self-awareness, which also means an awareness of the universality of life, unlimited rights cannot be granted to all. Rather, the social recognition of their individuality must be confined within convenient limits. Culture is self-development, and, as such, it must be critical of all knowledge that man does not need for the actual realization of his human nature, and for the growth and health of his moral character. And a footnote here says, "This is also the philosophical justification of some degree of state censorship." In short, it must be critical of all knowledge that is not genuinely human. Character is defined as constancy of will, a constancy which endows human willing with unity, necessity, rationality, universality. And Gentile elaborates his explanation by reference to his conception of the transcendental society, whereby character is immanent in experience, but strictly as the form of experience, and not as its content. Quote, "The form of experience means here the principle that is active and constructive a priori, the principle that makes experience possible, and so cannot be a product of experience." End quote. This being so, Gentile is also able to make a distinction between two kinds of treatments of political history. One, an empirical mechanistic mode of thought, and the other, a genuinely speculative idealism. True history is that which observes not the brute fact, or an act conceived as a simple object for conscious knowledge, and as such something as irrational and necessary as a natural phenomena, since it is external to the spirit that considers it, end quote, but rather the inward act of the spirit, which is the very act of self-consciousness. We note here Gentile's subtle refinement of Hegel's immanent idealism so that it is purged of its objective defects. Quote, "But the people who shudder at the idea of worshipping the state are quite right if the state is conceived as the unity of being and non-being, so that it always implies a transcendent element. For in this transcendent state, this higher ideal that operates as an end in the actual life of the state, the theists have all the room they can desire to make a distinction between the divine and the human aspects of the state, and set the higher norm to which they would have the state subordinated above and beyond the perpetuum mobile that is its history." End quote. Relationships between states must be dictated by the same principles that govern relationships between individuals, and the attempt to achieve a transcendental unity does not obviate the necessity of war between states, since this is even a means to this unity. Gentile is aware that there can never be one universal state, but out of temporary unities will ever arise further differences. Quote, "Unity is a fine thing, but it must be a unity amid variety, including all the differences that eternally arise from its own process of realization. Gentile's historical realism is indeed an integral part of his transcendental idealism, which acknowledges the need of striving for a higher unity, but simultaneously validates the diversity of the forms of experience which constitute human history. Like Fichte and Hegel, Gentile declares that the Kantian ideal of a perpetual peace is self-defeating since it would lead to the death of all states, Like Fichte and Hegel, Gentile declares that the Kantian ideal of a perpetual peace is a self-defeating one, since it would lead to the death of all states, whereas master and pupil, parent and child, teacher and learner, lord and slave, dominant peoples and dominated peoples, where superior civilization may be the index of superior power, or vice versa, these are all original and inevitable oppositions which spiritual activity transcends and reconciles. This reconciliation of opposites resembles Hegel's dialectic. However, it must be noted that whereas Hegel gave a merely dialectical historical justification of war, as well as morality in general, Gentile based his justification more firmly on the higher Kantian goal of the transcendent unity of the spirit. So that is the end of chapter 6, and I'll read chapter 7 maybe tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. I'll really appreciate it. Have a nice day.